Okay, now that we've got some basic materials put onto our Lego minifigure, as you can see, we'll switch our viewport shading mode over here to texture, or rather, sorry, material. And that'll show us kind of roughly the colors we've picked. If we choose a rendered viewport, of course, it fully shades and kind of starts to really refine that. Now that we've got those applied, those are what are called procedural materials. In other words, the computer is generating those based on a series of parameters that we've handed to it. We need to actually apply a texture to the face here in order to make this look like a proper Lego minifigure, because of course they have the little smiley face or some sort of facial expression put on them, which we just don't have right now. And there are a couple of ways to do that, but it's time for us to start getting into the node editor a little more deeply, because that's sort of the most sensible way to start looking at these materials once they start getting multifaceted or made of a lot of different parts. So I'm going to mouse over this little traction area down here and split. Whoop. Missed. I'm going to split my window out so that I've got one eye on a rendered view over here, and this window I'm going to change into a node editor. And if I click to select the head, then I can see basically the node equivalent of the values that we selected over here in the materials tab. We have our color selected. Our first shader is a mix shader, and it is mixing a diffuse and a glossy shader. And those both show up over here. The diffuse shows basically the same information, just a little bit of a different presentation. And then there's the mix shader, and it is hooked directly into the output. So what I need to do is I need to introduce some new elements here. So basically, I've created a Lego face, kind of a template in Adobe Illustrator, and I've saved that out as a JPEG file and also a PNG file, and both of those should be in your downloads for the class. So I'm going to click on Add here. I'm going to go to texture, not shader, and I'm going to introduce an image texture node. So if I click on that, it loads my cursor with an image texture node, and that allows me basically to come up here and select an image texture. If I click on open, then I have my PNG file right here, and I can click on this little 4 square icon here to kind of look at a preview, and you can see that that file, unlike the JPEG, actually has some transparency. So I'm going to double click on that to open it, and I've loaded this image texture node with that PNG file. Now you can see that that has made no changes over here to my rendered view. That's because these nodes are not connected in any way right now. So what I'm going to do here is, let me see if I can remember, I'm going to add a shader, and it's going to be a mix shader. Where that mix shader is, I'm going to unplug the diffuse shader and plug it in as one of my mixes, and then I'm going to plug the image texture in as another one. And then I am going to plug that shader in there. Now for the factor, the mix factor, that's this guy right here. That's a little bit misnamed because factor kind of implies that you can only give that a numerical value. But really what I can do is I can take the alpha channel from my image here and I can plug that into the factor, and I can say, you know what, use the alpha channel as your set of instructions as far as how to mix this. So that's kind of working, but you can see that over here, the result, obviously it's done something, but it doesn't seem to have done anything that we wanted. So I'm going to switch back out of rendered viewport shading mode into solid mode. I'm going to select the head here, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's called UV mapping. So if I tab into edit mode on the head and tap A to select all, I'm going to come over here and change this to a UV image editor. And from here, I can actually load up any images that I'm using. I've got my reference image, and I've also got my Lego face with the alpha channel, the PNG file. So what I need to do is I need to give the computer, I need to give Blender some instructions as far as what pixels from this image go where on this head. So I'm going to, I have a little bit of groundwork here to do before I actually am ready to give it those instructions. And really, I kind of only need to deal with part of it. Obviously, none of the face is going to be up here on the button, top of the head. None of it's going to be down here on the neck. So I am just going to, I'm going to deselect everything. I'm going to Option click to select, and then Shift Option click to select a couple of loops here. I'm going to come all the way around to the back of my model, Control numpad 1. And sorry, you can tell I'm making this up as I go. I've gotten ahead of myself. So I need to, just like if you were sewing a shirt or something, you kind of have to decide where the seams go. You make something that is three-dimensional out of flat pieces of cloth. So we kind of need to think about this the same way. We're basically going to be unwrapping the head here, and I need to tell Blender where the seams are. I don't want the seam right in the middle. You'll see why in a minute. Of the front, I don't want it in the middle of the front. I want it in the back because there's no facial detail there. So I'm going to go over here to my Shading UVs tab, and I'm going to click on Mark Seam. You can see that those edges, I'm in Edge Select mode, those edges turned kind of reddish. And that's basically what I want. So now if I go back into Face Select mode, Option Shift click to get my my loops selected in faces, then I can just come over here, and under UV mapping I can pull this down and click on Unwrap. And you can see that all of a sudden I've got some information here. Okay, so in order for you to see what this does, I'm going to go back to a rendered viewport. Okay, and you can see, now this doesn't look like much, but you can see that what I have here actually does correspond to some of my imagery here. I've got this little lower lip shadow here, and I've got a face here, and that's all showing up here. Basically, what Blender is showing me here, let me tab back into solid wireframe mode. Actually, you know what? Let's go to our texture view. Okay, and you can see a little better here. The selected faces here correspond to the faces or vertices that are being represented over here in the UV image editor. So that tells me basically what vertices over here are going to be picking up the pixels that I'm putting them over the top of when I look over here in the 3D viewport. So for instance, we have this little kind of cheek muscle shadow here. Obviously, if I go into vertex select mode, there's going to be a vertex right there and one right there. I can tell that those are correspondent to this and this vertex over here. Now we've got a little bit of distortion here, but we probably don't have enough. It's on the edges here. You can see it's bowed out a little. It's probably not going to be a big deal. So over here, this is two-dimensional, whereas in the 3D viewport, I scale in the Z-axis to scale something vertically. When I only have 2 dimensions, I only have an X and a Y axis. So over here, this is obviously too short. So I scale this in the Y axis, which again is vertical in a 2D viewport. Grab it in Y, bring it up, just kind of alternate between those 2 commands to scale and grab, scale and grab until you've basically got it stretched to populate the size of your image. Okay, and just for me, I'm going to box select these rows of vertices and scale them in Y by a factor of 0 to flatten them out. Because as you scale things, that curvature, that distortion that we have there tends to exaggerate its scales as well. So scale in Y by a factor of 0. Do the same thing here. I'd just rather not deal with the complications that come from that. So I'm going to flatten those. There we go. You can see over here in the 3D viewport that this is starting to look like one of the backyardigans. It doesn't look quite right. It's too wide. The face is too wide. So if I select everything, tap A to select all over here in the UV image editor, and then scale in the X-axis, whoops, wrong way, scale this vertically, I can make that face, those facial pixels, take up less of the geometry by scaling it larger. Now we've gone off of our image map here. We've exceeded its bounds, and basically what Blender does in those instances is it repeats the image texture. So you can see we've actually got kind of a disjointed face on the back of the head there as well, and that's not what we want at all. We don't want that happening. So over here in our UV image editor, we basically have the same tools as we have in the 3D viewport. We have a 2D cursor instead of a 3D cursor, and I can position that the same way I can in the 3D viewport. I'm going to select this vertex, Shift S, and then cursor to selected will move my 3D cursor to the position of that vertex. I can then change my pivot point to the 2D cursor, then box select everything to one side of that cursor and just scale it in to be back on the map. I don't want to mess with the face there because it's actually proportioned the way I want. You can see we're now back on the map with all this information. There's nothing there, no pixels actually defined there. So we can just kind of scrunch things in. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Select a vertex, cursor to selected, and then scale in X. Bring it all in, and you can see that that second face on the back of my model has now disappeared. But if you come around to the front, the original face is there, and it's still proportioned correctly. That's because we didn't touch any of the geometry that was actually mapped to those pixels. And that is UV image mapping. So let's look at our rendered viewport again, and you can see that while the face is proportioned correctly, it's doing something kind of odd here. It's just letting our yellow image bleed through, and that's kind of strange. So let's go back to our node editor, and I'll show you why. The reason for that is basically the alpha channel from our image texture is telling this mix shader here how to blend the image and the yellow diffuse color that we made. So it's basically saying, watch me for transparency. So I think I know, I'm going to try and experiment how to potentially fix this. Basically, it's telling the yellow portion to be opaque where the yellow diffuse shader to be opaque where the alpha channel is opaque. So I think if I just swap places with those two, so I'm going to plug the yellow diffuse shader in where the image texture is, and you can see sure enough that fixed it. So now over here we have black where there should be black and yellow where there should be yellow. You might notice, however, if you were keenly observing, that my image texture that I made, the PNG file, actually has white highlights in the eyes. And this is not showing them. Let's have a look at the UV image editor again. You can see those are something I actually drew in Illustrator, and they're not showing up here. That is because, if we look at the node editor here again, you might remember that a diffuse shader is actually what tells an object to have a certain color, and that's all color information that's not showing up. So what I'm going to do is this image texture up here, basically it's not actually telling the mix shader to represent some color there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the diffuse shader, and I'm going to duplicate it by tapping on Shift-D, bring it up. I'm going to plug the color node from the image texture into the color node of this diffuse shader, unplug it from the mix, and then bring that down to plug into the mix. And you can see, yep, there, the actual color information from that PNG file is now showing up. So we've got all this alpha information in our PNG file, and the only actual visible pixels are the eyes, the eyebrows, the mouth, and then the cheek and lower lip shadows. Other than that, everything else is just transparent. It's an alpha channel. And those are showing up here okay. We've got our procedural yellow over here, which we want to show where there is no image texture information. So you can put this whole shader together just in the surface pull down under our materials tab, but it starts to get kind of heavily stacked there, and it starts to get a little confusing. So we can actually get the node editor basically gives us a flow chart of what's going on here, and that's a much more sensible way to look at things. So again, essentially what we have here, we have an image texture which is giving diffuse, which is passed on to a diffuse shader, which mixes with a yellow diffuse shader. So basically we have those two, and they go into a mix shader. The mix for them is determined by the alpha channel of our image texture. So how to mix those. Basically we use that alpha channel as instructions. The output from that mix shader goes to another mix shader, which also has an input from a glossy shader. That gives us our nice specular highlight there that makes it look plasticky. And on that mix shader, basically, the two outputs there, we have our factor very far to the left, which means it's in favor of the top shader input node. It's a factor of 0.125. That's not showing the glossy result very much at all. Mostly we're showing the result of this top mix shader. So that's what that factor does. You push it to the left, and it biases towards the top input node. And from there, basically we go to our output, our surface. And that's what's creating our surface here. And that results in a fairly realistic looking, a nice image here. We could use the exact same process to put a decal, for instance, onto our Lego man's torso if we wanted to be a little more realistic there. We can use this process to give details from images generated in other programs like Adobe Illustrator or Adobe Photoshop. We can, or even take photographs. We can place those details onto our 3D models. So I hope this helps, and I will see you in class.